Hello and welcome to SolarWorks for Illinois. I'm Tim Montague, your host with Continental Electrical Construction. This is our monthly webinar that we give on various topics related to solar energy and solar power in Illinois and the Midwest. I'm really pleased today to be introducing the topic of community solar, how it works in general and especially here in Illinois. And our special guest speaker is Eric Pasi, who is Chief Development Officer for IPS Solar, based in Minnesota and now with an operation here in Illinois. Welcome to the webinar, Eric.
Good afternoon, Tim. Thanks for having me today.
Really appreciate having you here and IPS. Your CEO, Ralph Jacobson, he pretty much wrote the book, is my understanding, on community solar in Minnesota, and IPS is one of the fastest growing solar developers in the upper Midwest. You've won many accolades and you've already got 50 megawatts of projects under your belt. I'm guessing another 100 or so megawatts of projects in the pipeline. So it's great to have you here. Before we launch into the nitty gritties of community solar, I wanted to just step back for a second and give our listeners a quick overview of what community solar is. You know, we think of solar typically as rooftop solar arrays or ground-mounted solar arrays that are feeding power into a facility. We call that behind-the-meter solar. And that is by far and away the most common form of solar that we see both here in the Midwest and around the country. But there's also a form of solar that really anyone can take advantage of, and that's called community solar. And that started in around 2008. There was a project in California, and then there were some projects in Colorado. And then Massachusetts came online in earnest, and now Minnesota, where there's really good legislation that allows for a centrally owned array. It could be a 500 kW array, it could be a 2 megawatt array. And then there are literally dozens or up to several hundred subscribers to that array. And what that means is you don't have to have solar on your facility. You can subscribe to a solar facility that is in some disparate place, and you're doing that via what we call virtual net metering. So the electrons that flow out of the array are accounted for by a meter and then credited to your account. They reduce your power bill, but you're also then consuming clean, green solar energy. So that's community solar in a nutshell. I know that IPS is a very mission-driven company, Eric, and you as well are a mission-driven professional. So tell us a little bit about how you got into solar and what drew you to IPS.
Absolutely. I started with IPS in 2007, so I'm celebrating my 11th year in the solar industry. At that time, I was just graduating from the University of Minnesota and was very much moved by the science and impacts of climate change. And at that time, I was looking for a small, or I guess any company within the renewable space. It just turns out that most of the companies are small at the time. IPS was one of the companies that was very close to the Twin Cities campus here, and I joined up with Ralph and Jamie, and I think at that point where we had 6 folks on staff. Today we have over close to 50 and are continuing to grow. So it's always been part of our core culture here at IPS to do what we can in mitigating the negative effects of climate change. And just so happens that solar is our vehicle, and we live, breathe, live and breathe it. And just like you, Tim, on social media, espouse, all of the positive things about solar on a daily basis. And so have really transitioned here, and I'll get into that a bit more, into focusing on community solar, and are excited about Illinois and the FEJA bill as a tool to allow folks, residences, and commercial organizations to adopt solar in meaningful ways where they otherwise couldn't have to begin with.
Great, and you mentioned FEJA, and we can get into that in the course of the conversation. But just so everyone knows, that is the Future Energy Jobs Act, and that is a law that went into effect in June of 2017. So we're now a year in to FEJA. We're still waiting for some of the I's to be dotted and the T's to be crossed. But that program is going to come into full force in Q3 of this year. And then we will see a massive expansion of the solar industry, both rooftop and ground mount, both small DG and large community solar, which is small utility scale and then utility scale. And you'll see that really in 2019 and beyond. So why don't you go ahead, Eric, and tell us more about your perspective on community solar, and if it's okay, I will ask you questions along the way.
Sounds good. All right, I'll get into it here. Once again, thanks everybody for joining us. IPS Solar, the name of our company here. We are a solar development and EPC based out of Minnesota, but have operations, as Tim mentioned, in Illinois, Michigan, and throughout the upper Midwest. So today I wanted to just talk a little bit about who we are, what we're up to, talk about the community solar program in Illinois, and specifically touch on rooftop community solar and the Solar for All program. Discuss the lessons learned that we had here in Minnesota, which I think would be applicable or transferred to Illinois and other markets. And then wrap things up with a discussion about a developer toolkit that we've been pulling together that both aligns developers and subscribers and project owners. And I'll get into that here later on. Quickly about us, founded in 1991 by Ralph Jacobson in Minnesota. We are one of the fastest growing company in Minnesota. We've also been recognized as the number 16 U.S. commercial solar developer by Solar Power World magazine. NABCEP certified, have about 70 megawatts that are completed, and are in general just continuing our growth into other markets. So we do everything from development, financing projects, to the installation and then operations of these projects long term. Much like a lot of the solar companies out there, started in the rooftop small residential space. When I started, the first project I was ever involved with was a 2-panel domestic hot water system for a couple in West St. Paul. And then moved on to the second project was a 3-kilowatt installation. Today we're doing 5 megawatt projects and anywhere from 1 to 5 megawatt projects. That's a photo of a recent installation in the Mounds View School District, which is just right outside of the St. Paul, Minnesota, where we've done 12 of their 13 facilities we've installed solar on. So that's kind of an example of everything from the upfront development work through financing for those projects on behalf of the school district to the installation and then operations long term. Tim, you mentioned this at the beginning, but the idea about community solar really is an off-site solar garden that produces bill credits for subscribers. There's a minimum of 5 subscribers per garden. And the typical model is that there's no upfront cost to participate. The developer and the project owner front all those upfront fees, including the installation costs. And then over time, the subscribers pay back the owner-operator via a long-term power purchase agreement. And that's been our model. The offsite solar garden is kind of just, it's typical, but it by no means has to be offsite. We've seen a proliferation and will continue to see more on-site community solar projects, which would be for example, on a school's rooftop, where they're hosting the garden, they're participating in the bill credits, and then also allowing others to participate as well. Future Energy Jobs Act is what's making this possible. The stated goal within FEJA is 1.3 gigawatts of wind, 3 gigawatts of solar by 2030, with about half of that coming by 2021. A specific subset of that 1.5 gigawatts of solar is meant for what would be known as distributed solar, or DG. A lot of those megawatts will be filled by utility scale, but in the distributed solar space, what's meant by distributed solar is typically anything that ties into the distribution network. So projects of say 2 to 4 megawatts or below. And within the distributed solar space, within that carve out is the adjustable block program, specifically for community solar. And so a fourth of those megawatts will go towards community solar. The adjustable block program is a REC-based program where qualifying projects submit applications, and then on a rolling basis are accepted into the program and awarded renewable energy credits for projects. And the timetable here I'll talk about in a minute. But what we've seen on the development side is considerable competition, both for land leases as well as queue position within the utility. The adjustable block program, as it is currently, is divided into two categories. One is for ComEd customers in Northern Illinois, and the second is with Ameren customers in the southern 2/3 of Illinois. Just recently, as part of the FEJA program development, it was recognized that rural co-ops and municipal power companies are also eligible for this program, the details of which are being ironed out. So the considerable competition piece to this is really a function of a few things. One is the continuing delay in the timelines and the timetables for these, for the first adjustable block, which originally was contemplated to be released in July of this year. We're seeing that be pushed back to later this year, which is allowing more projects to be become eligible within the program. And then also with the ruling by through FEJA to allow co-location, is essentially doubling the amount of applications. So we can have, what I mean by co-location is that a 1-2 megawatt garden can, on one parcel, a limitation is now two megawatt gardens in one, or solar gardens in one location on one parcel. And so essentially doubling the amount of applications is going to further restrict the amount of RECs, renewable energy credits, that are available to projects, and increasing the competition for those RECs. All right. So the timeline, on April 3rd, I believe it was. The program was formally approved. Co-location rules were defined, which again is causing some consternation on behalf of the development community. We expect the program administrator to be selected here very soon, by June, and then further program development. This is where things are somewhat still in flux, as firm dates have not been settled. So as the program administrator is selected, as other rules, including Tim, as you mentioned, in June, the further definition of the REC pricing, renewable energy credit pricing, some of those final details are still yet to be sorted out. That will happen between, say, July and potentially November, when we anticipate the first adjustable block program to open. This date has not been set yet, so I wouldn't put any weight on these estimates, other than to say that again, they're just estimates. We believe that the first adjustable block will open sometime between November and January, November 2018 and January 2019. And then within 1 to 3 months, the total REC pool will have been awarded to projects, and we'll start to begin to see our first community solar projects constructed in 2019. As part of the development timeline, I'll get into that here, just quickly. The IPA is requiring that a project should have all ministerial permits and interconnection agreements signed before entering the block, which when you're dealing with utilities, as you can imagine, these programs are very popular. It has stretched out the interconnection timelines with utilities considerably, where we're seeing nearly 6 to 7 months of interconnection timelines with ComEd currently. And so that's really putting pressure on developers to get their applications in as quickly as possible in anticipation of the first blocks opening late this year. And so Ameren timetables should be eased a bit, but in terms of ComEd, those projects are really feeling a pinch here to make sure that they give themselves enough time in order to get all their ducks in a row from an interconnection standpoint, in order to be eligible for the program. Rooftop community solar. So we at IPS have prided ourselves in thinking outside the box. When I get to the portion of my presentation where I talk a little bit about Minnesota and how that compares with Illinois, we'll talk specifically about why it is that we're seeing more rooftop community solar being done. But some of the unique advantages for rooftop community solar as opposed to ground-mounted community solar really relies on both from a permitting standpoint as well as an interconnection standpoint. So what we've seen in Minnesota, as distribution networks and substations become more overburdened with distributed generation. And what I mean by that is, as projects are being developed, there's only so many megawatts that a distribution line or a substation can handle without the need for significant electrical upgrades to the grid. And what we're seeing on the rooftop side is that the location of those projects are in areas where there is so much load. There is virtually no limitation on the substations for interconnection. So from an interconnection standpoint, rooftop projects are usually a pretty safe bet from an interconnection standpoint. The other side is from the permitting standpoint. So for ground-mounted projects, what we will be seeing and have started to see is as the influx of applications are coming in from a special use or conditional use permits, that there is a almost visceral reaction by the community to say, we need to slow down. These projects may or may not affect my my property value, for instance, is one of the one of the apprehensions that we've heard from surrounding neighbors. Or there's a question of what's known as stray voltage. And as we continue to development, as we're all as these projects are becoming more popular, permitting becomes an issue. We're sometimes seeing moratoriums, for instance, in certain counties where there's just so much activity that there's not enough, that there's needs to be more time from authorities to digest these applications and get more feedback from the community. Rooftop really gets outside of that, right? So we've got this is a project that we're going to construct this year for the city of Edina in Minnesota. This is their public works facility. We don't need a special use permit in order to install these projects. We obviously still need a building permit. We will need to do structural analyses to make sure that the building can support the weight of these systems. But from a permitting standpoint, it's a much more streamlined process. And so I think that from a project standpoint, rooftops obviously have their advantages. On the drawback side, I mentioned structural. A lot of times, we'll have a structural engineer in for review of every rooftop system, but there are instances where the weight of the array the roof cannot support the additional weight. And that's obviously something at the beginning that you want to get a read on. Many structural engineering firms will allow you to do or will provide a kind of a high level structural analysis so that you're not getting into the nitty-gritty details of every joist on that roof, but will give you kind of an indicative thumbs up or thumbs down, so that you can proceed with confidence with a project without having to go through the costly and time consuming process of doing a in-depth structural analysis, which would be needed later on. The other aspect of rooftop community solar that is a difficulty is the roof age. And so, as you can imagine, you don't want to install a system on a roof that needs to be replaced in 2 years. The economic effect of having to detach and reset those systems over time is not ideal. In some situations, the project economics can bear having to do a detach and reset, but in general, you'll want to you would want to have that established ahead of time that yes, this is either a new roof or a new roof will be installed before the system is installed and commissioned. And so those are kind of the nuances or trade-offs between what you might see in a ground-mounted solar development versus rooftop.
And Eric, for any of our listeners, in our business, we typically are looking for rooftops that are 10 years old or younger. Mm-hmm. Is that a rule of thumb that you also use?
Yeah, that is it's a good rule of thumb. The way that the REC program is structured in Illinois, it is a 15-year REC. Obviously, that does not quite align with the warranted life of the solar panel, which is 25 years or more. But what we've seen is that the economics for doing 15-year projects is still good. And a 10-year, life of or age of a roof, that is a 25-year type of roof, is certainly within bounds. And of course, as you know, Tim, that is really going to depend on the type of roof, whether it's for instance, a built-up roof, a TPO roof, an EPDM. There are obviously very differences between roof types, and so we always rely on the expertise of roofing contractors who we view more as partners, in these types of projects, to analyze the roofs obviously before we install the equipment. We work with roofing contractors also to make sure that we're installing our equipment per the spec of the roofing membrane, and to make sure that we're not voiding warranties, etc. But there are additional considerations obviously for rooftop projects, and so here's just a list of, again, what I went through. The one thing that is also worth mentioning is that as we install equipment on roofs, we're typically at a lower angle for racking, where on a ground-mounted system we might be at 30 degrees or 25 degrees. On the roof, we're at usually 10 degrees or less. And that is great for reducing the amount of ballast weight that's required for these systems, but it also affects the production. And so there's a trade-off there between lower production and then also the lower development costs. So when you think about rooftop projects, you don't have to go through the civil work of installing roads and fences, etc. You don't have to. The installation is, you don't have to pound posts, etc., and do a ton of trenching. So the installation costs on a roof typically are lower than what you'd see on the ground. So that's the real trade-off between lower production and lower costs. And as a developer, or as a site host, you'll kind of understand that cost benefit analysis as you go through the process. All right. So another aspect to the FEJA bill is a focus, a program specific to low to moderate income, and that program is called Solar for All. In Minnesota, we have not had the benefit of Solar for All, of a Solar for All style program, and so we took it upon ourselves to work on a few of these. The Edina project that I showed earlier, the rooftop project, is a project similar to this one. This is a ribbon cutting for, it's actually a shovel groundbreaking, although we're on the roof in this case, for a project that we're doing on Shiloh Temple, which is a church in North Minneapolis. 100% of the subscribers for this garden are residents within the community of North Minneapolis. And so North Minneapolis is an economically disadvantaged community. And we've worked with partners, including Interfaith Power and Light, Cooperative Energy Futures, and others to bring this project to fruition. And what we're going to see in Illinois is an expansion on this. So this was a 200 kilowatt project. We expect to see multiple megawatts of projects, solar projects within the community that where the economic benefits stay within the community. And we're excited to work on strategic partnerships to bring these types of projects to Illinois. And I think developers would do well to, continue to keep those types of projects in mind reach out to disadvantaged communities, bring them into the conversation, both from a subscription standpoint as it relates to community solar, but also from a workforce standpoint as well. And so we would encourage builders of projects, contractors, to also, look to these communities for workforce, as we're going to see a significant jump in solar jobs in Illinois over the next, call it 24 to 36 months. So I want to take a step back a little bit and talk about community solar in Minnesota and how that compares or may compare to Illinois. 2013, we passed what was known at the time as the Solar Jobs Act. And within that piece of legislation was language that enacted the largest community solar program in the U.S. And potentially in the world. We have currently 350 megawatts of solar that is online, with another 400 megawatts in active applications. Excel has mentioned that by the end of this year, we should have 600 megawatts or so of community solar online and active, which would be larger than all of the other community solar markets in the U.S. combined. We saw at the outset some significant hurdles in some of these categories that are outlined here. The first was the deposits and the application fees. For each project, we needed to have anywhere from $100,000 to $500,000 worth of deposit fees, or deposits and fees, that really crowded out some of the smaller companies from participating in this program. It's somewhat similar to Illinois, I would say, in that there's a considerable amount of at-risk development capital for interconnection costs and lease acquisition, et cetera, before there's any certainty surrounding the renewable energy credits. And so I would kind of classify that as a similarity between Minnesota and Illinois. We also saw a considerable amount of competition, and we were kind of a hometown team in Minnesota. Saw a lot of companies from West Coast and East Coast come in and develop projects or attempt to develop projects. Sun Edison was an early pioneer, I would say, from a policy standpoint, to help craft this program. Of course, they were doing policy work as well as land acquisition and doing some of the early developments. So it wasn't totally they had some motivation to do it. But what we saw is that as the market really, with all of that competition, certain companies were forced out of business. One organization I remember here pretty can recall that they started up specifically for community solar in 2014. They weren't able to get a project off the ground for 2+ years, and subsequently had to sell their development assets to another party. And that is one takeaway I think that others in Illinois should do well to take heed, which is I think it would be it wouldn't be a great idea to put all of your eggs in the community solar basket, especially in this first year, as we're going to see a lot of competition. The amount of projects that will actually get funded will be a fraction of what gets actually submitted. And so looking to other markets and other projects, that you can develop outside of community solar, so to allow for this kind of settling out period where there's an there's a large appetite for these types of projects. You want to be able to weather that storm, that first storm, so that you can get to year 2, year 3, and beyond of the community solar program. In Minnesota, we also had restrictions, geographic restrictions for subscribers. You don't have that in Illinois. We had to have all of our subscribers for a project needed to be located in that county or an adjacent county. In Illinois, it's restricted to utility territory, which is pretty broad. And so that is not necessarily a parallel between the two states. We've also seen a transition from the retail rate, which was the first rate for projects, where we saw the rate plus our renewable energy credit at about 12 to 15 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, after detailed studies, transitioning to what's known as the value of solar, which is currently set at less than 10 cents per kilowatt hour. So as the market matures, we've seen a decrease in the value of these credits, and subsequently the value of projects. And that's to be expected in a maturing market as we get to scale and are looking at projects that, honestly, we have to keep up with the industry-wide trends of reducing costs and making sure that these projects aren't a burden on non-community solar ratepayers. All right, so this is a quick snapshot of some of our projects in Minnesota. We've done a lot to date, especially in the surrounding, I would call it ex-urban areas of Minnesota. This, now I'll get into a couple of example projects that we've done. This is the Red Wing Community Solar Project. If you're familiar with Red Wing shoes, same city. This is adjacent to a high school in Red Wings, 40 acres of solar, or about 6 megawatts of projects, so a little bit larger than what we might expect in Illinois, but gives you an idea of scale. Some of the development challenges here were soil conditions. So this was very sandy soil. We needed to use helical screws in order to make sure that the panels would stay put. We also had to contend with a 1 in 500 year rain event during the construction of this project, and so sediment control, just general site conditions were very challenging for this particular project. And from the build standpoint, that I would expect to see and hear similar situations of construction challenges that you'll run into. This was from the ribbon cutting. This is the superintendent of the Red Wing School District. And the director of buildings and grounds for Red Wing Schools gave a really good, honestly, promotion for community solar, in that the district is able to save over $7 million in the next 25 years without having any upfront expenditures. And so it's obviously a win scenario. And anytime you can have clients that can get out there and advocate on behalf of solar and your company, is obviously a really good thing. This is a project that we constructed in Chisago, Minnesota, in Center City. This is a cheese and bison ranch. You can kind of see, maybe my cursor will show up here. We, in 2012, had constructed a 40 kilowatt project back here for the cheese operation, or the cheese factory, which is located back here. We went back to that client and said, hey, there's a new program that's coming out. Would you be interested in leasing more of your land for community solar? And he was very gracious, and obviously there's a financial component to this, and we're seeing farmers earn more per acre leasing to solar projects than they do for ag purposes. And so, this was another kind of win-win situation for the customer as well as for us. So lessons that we've learned in Minnesota. I would call ourselves a small fish compared to some of the other folks that, and I mentioned, larger, companies from the coast coming in. I think that there are a lot of advantages to being a small fish and developing projects in ways that you're closer to the customer, you're closer to the action. I just think that there shouldn't be any hesitation in developing projects simply because you're a smaller company. We found that land acquisition and permitting obviously are much more difficult than we would have imagined. I think that that's going to continue to be the case in Illinois. You want to make sure you're out talking with the neighbors, you're out talking with the landowners, the authorities having jurisdiction. You're having conversations early so that you're not having to do damage control later on. Subscriber acquisition was also a challenge for us. It's obviously something that developers are going to want to keep in mind. We're obviously very up to speed on those conversations now. I'll get into that in a minute. Financing challenges as well. You want to make sure that the agreements that you're using are financeable. You want to make sure that that you're having financing conversations early so that you can head off some of the what could be deal breakers later on. You want to make sure you handle that up front. And then what we found is being, looking at ourselves as a partner in these types of projects and not necessarily a competitor either to other developers or to the utility company. We've wanted to take a non-adversarial approach to development, and we found that has benefited us in the long run as well. So I also wanted to just make a quick plug here. This is a product that we've been developing called the Community Solar Toolbox. And what we've seen in Minnesota, as we digested or went back and looked at what we've done and, said to ourselves, okay, what would we have wanted early on? What would have been helpful to us as a developer or as somebody that wanted to do a project that we didn't have access to. And so what we're prepared to launch is a portal essentially that allows for sample RFPs and local ordinances to kind of the non-development community or for subscriber community. But then also a developer toolbox, which would include a standard lease agreement that's been reviewed by multiple financing parties. So it's a financeable document. Standard subscriber agreement, again, financeable subscriber agreement. A subscription exchange portal where we've seen some developers are very good at finding land. Some developers are very good at subscription acquisition. Some are very good at permitting. Some companies are very good at construction. What we've seen is that there's a need for, in order for projects to get across the finish line, there's a need for collaboration, and that's what this website is meant to do. And so not only subscription exchange portal, but also project exchange portal. And so IPS, we have transacted on close to 100 million annual kilowatt hours. I'll walk that back for 20 million annual kilowatt hours for projects in Minnesota. We would see that there are opportunities in Illinois as well. And so again, this toolbox, if you're interested in learning more about it, would absolutely encourage you to send me a note or connect with Tim afterwards, and we can certainly put you on the mailing list so that once this is ready for beta or ready for a full release, that you have access to it and can stay informed. With that, Tim, let's, I guess I've been seeing questions or submissions maybe pop up here over the last few minutes. Maybe we can hop into that.
Thanks, Eric. And I do want to review how there are kind of two perspectives with community solar, right? There's the landowner or the facility owner that's leasing their roof or their land. And then there's the off-taker or the subscriber perspective.
Yep.
When you mentioned in the Red Wing project that the school district was going to save some, $7 million. Can you give us a quick high-level overview of how, if you're a school district or a city or a county with some facilities, how does community solar translate into savings for those entities?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. There, in this case, the Red Wing School District, there was both a lease payment that gets made to the school for allowing us to install the project at their on their property, and then also a subscription benefits. And so if you are looking at hosting community solar array and subscribing to community solar, there are kind of dual income streams for those situations, and it works out pretty well on behalf of whether it's a school district or a county or a large Fortune 500 company. The economics are obviously going to depend on your specific model. And I can't necessarily speak to what that might be for folks, but suffice to say that there are definite economic opportunities for both subscribers as well as hosts within community solar. Thank you. And to the listeners, you can chat your questions into the chat box or raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can speak to me and Eric directly. But please do ask your questions. This is very useful for everyone when listeners ask questions of us and our speaker. One of the listeners was asking, so if I'm a subscriber to a community solar project, what is the ROI for me? And one of the models I hear from developers is we would typically offer a 10% discount over what a subscriber is paying retail. What do you see in the market, Eric? Yep, I would say that that's consistent. When we, Cook County has done a really good job of kind of analyzing the economic opportunity for subscribers. They have a really comprehensive report that they released early, maybe it was late last year, where there are a couple of different models, but I would say 90 to maybe even 99% of the projects that we're going to see done in Illinois will be a zero upfront type of arrangement where the subscriber doesn't have an upfront cost, so there's not necessarily an ROI or a payback period. There are co-op models and different models where there is common ownership. I will say that those projects are extremely complex and difficult to get off the ground, mainly as it relates to the securities issues for investing, and as well as just the complexity of having multiple ownership models and within the confines of having to monetize tax incentives, et cetera. So to the listener's question, I think a 10% discount is probably within the realm of possibility, and definitely not outside of the market as far as what we're seeing. But there's not necessarily an upfront cost that needs to be recouped on behalf of the subscriber. A
few other questions coming in about these solar farm, the mechanical system. Tell us about a typical solar array structure for ground mount. What is your preferred methodology in terms of, 2 panels up portrait or 4 panels up? Give us a quick overview of how that works.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is maybe a good slide to have up. We are using a 2-panel portrait racking system here. What type of equipment that we use, it really depends on the soil conditions of a site. If the site is very challenging, I think if you can recall back to a couple slides previous to this, the Red Wing Community Solar Array, where we did have sandy soils, we did use a helical approach or helical anchor for the foundations in those projects, or that project. And that required us to flip the orientation to 4 panels high in landscape. There's some, I think, production benefits to having panels at 4 high in landscape. I'm not an engineer, just a lowly salesperson, but they, from my understanding is, with snow, with snow events, inter-row shading, if there is any, hopefully there's not, but having that isolated to really the bottom panel, which is, having that be 1 of 4 versus 1 of 2. My understanding is that there are some advantages there. But really soil conditions dictate it. Geotechnical, structural engineering on these projects will determine how deep of an embedment we need for foundations or for piers. So if it's a C-channel, I-beam, whatever it might be, we're having to go down 10 feet or more potentially. Illinois is similar to Minnesota in that there's frost heave issues that we'll have to consider. And so that makes our embedment depths much deeper, required embedment depths much deeper than they would be in, say, Texas or elsewhere where we don't have to deal with, the freeze and thaw of the ground on an annual basis. So,
and then Eric, let's make the distinction between fixed racking and
yes.
and single axis trackers.
Yes, absolutely.
Because we are seeing about half the projects that we've seen here at Continental are using single axis trackers, but many are still using fixed ground mount.
Absolutely, yes. So that's a good distinction. In Minnesota, early on, IPS was exclusively using fixed racking, mainly just to keep it simple. As you can probably appreciate, Tim, cold weather environments that, constant freeze, going anywhere from -20 to 100 degrees or more, that puts a lot of stress on mechanical equipment, mechanical parts. We are definitely seeing a shift. We're seeing a shift to single axis tracking in a pretty significant way. In Illinois, under community solar, where it's a volumetric program, what I mean by that is you're compensated by the per kilowatt hour and not a combination of the kilowatt hour and capacity. In situations where it's volumetric and you want to maximize the amount of kilowatt hours that are produced per a megawatt limit, in this case 2 megawatts AC limit, then single axis tracking really starts to make sense. You want to look at the site though, obviously, and whether or not it makes sense for the site. But we are also seeing a shift as these tracking companies and racking companies become more sophisticated in cold weather, extreme climates, in northern climates. A lot of finance partners and finance companies and developers are becoming more comfortable with single axis tracking, which is why we're starting to see a proliferation of those types of projects.
And then what about interconnection, and is is this something that non-experienced solar developers can pursue on their own? Because I do get a lot of questions, and we have a question from the audience about this. If there's a community organization or a government entity that says, okay, let's develop a community solar array, is that something that non-experts can do on their own, or what is your advice there?
It's really difficult. Interconnection requires a level of knowledge of both construction as well as electrical engineering and other engineering specialties that it really is difficult to try to set out and do it on your own if you don't have any expertise. And unfortunately, that's the way that it goes. And you would do better to partner with a developer or to hire an engineering firm if you have the wherewithal to have dollars that are eligible for those types of projects, than to try to do it on your own. Because what will happen is that as you submit these applications, you try to go through the processes and outlines given by the utility. Inevitably, you're going to have to go back again and again and again, revising drawings, having a constant communication with the utility that if you're not prepared and have a staff person for that or have expertise, it's going to be an extreme challenge. And so most organizations are going to want to partner with somebody that has that expertise. You can hire engineering companies to work through interconnection with you, but it's going to cost dollars. Developers will typically do that for you in exchange for exclusivity in developing the project. So those are the trade-offs.
Yeah, I would concur. This is not something that non-experts should attempt on their own. And you can check out the Illinois Solar Energy Association, illinoissolar.org, for a list of both commercial solar developers and solar installers, as well as residential. So the full spectrum of the ecosystem is available to you there at illinoissolar.org. How long does a subscriber need to commit, and are the agreements transferable?
The agreements should be fully transferable. What we're seeing is that the models, it could be anywhere from 2 years to 15 to or more years of commitment on behalf of the subscriber. That's going to depend on the developer's model, and so so if you're looking at our community solar toolbox, the agreements that are in the toolbox do allow for transferability at the discretion of the developer, but that transferability, the language in there shall not, be withheld unreasonably. So there is contemplation of, subscribers moving, subscribers, wanting to gift their subscription to someone. That's all included within that kind of sample subscriber agreement. But again, it kind of goes back to the developer's model as far as the term or length of that agreement, whether it's 2 years or more or 15 years.
Yeah, and so in Illinois, if you're a subscriber in ComEd to a community solar project, and then you move out of state or move to Ameren, that would make your contract null and void. So there is an escape clause. Otherwise, the intention of the law, I think, is that you're in a long-term power purchase agreement as long as you're in that territory. But there are probably ways for you to quote unquote get out of the agreement. We're at the end of the day, we're talking about 3,000 megawatts of solar. It's a relatively small chunk of the grid. It is going to help us get to 25% green power on the grid here in Illinois by 2025, and that is the intention of the Future Energy Jobs Act with this chunk of solar and wind. Well, we're nearing the noontime hour. I want to encourage everybody to reach out to myself and Eric. Our phone numbers are here on the concluding slide, and our emails are a little hard to read, but I'm Tim Montague, TMONTAGUE at CECCO.com. And Eric, how can listeners reach out to you?
I absolutely connect with me on LinkedIn. I typically share quite a bit of kind of our experiences and obviously salient news as it relates to community solar in the Midwest. So you can find me on LinkedIn. And then also email works best for me, which is, where we go here, Eric P, so it's ERICP at IPS-solar.com. Feel free to reach out to me, and if you're interested on the Community Solar Toolbox as well, or if you've got projects that you're looking to collaborate on, happy to give some feedback. So email's the best way to get a hold of me, Eric P at IPS-solar.com.
Great. And just a heads up, we'll be offering another one of these Solar Works for Illinois webinars on June 26th. I'm going to discuss the 5 ways that solar energy pays back. So that's a focus on commercial, industrial, solar, and behind the meter projects. So you can register for that at CECCO.com. I'm Tim Montague, your host with Continental Electric. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining us today.
All right, thank you.
And thanks to all our listeners. We hope to see you in the future.